The room believed it was about to witness an ordinary joke, but before the evening ended, everyone would learn that dignity has a way of silencing even the loudest crowd. The grand ballroom of St. Gabriel Medical Center shimmered beneath crystal chandeliers as more than 300 guests gathered for the hospital's annual charity gala. Doctors in tailored tuxedos exchanged stories with philanthropists, executives, and community leaders, while waiters carried silver trays filled with sparkling water and elegant appetizers through the polished marble hall. Soft piano music floated across the room, blending with laughter and polite conversation. Every table displayed fresh white roses beneath warm golden lights, creating the image of generosity and celebration. Yet hidden behind that polished elegance stood people whose work would never be acknowledged from the stage. One of them quietly pushed a housekeeping cart toward the service hallway. Her name was Vanessa Brooks, a 31-year-old black woman whose blue housekeeping uniform blended so completely into the background that most guests never looked at her twice. She moved carefully across the floor, collecting empty glasses, wiping fingerprints from polished surfaces, and offering warm smiles to strangers who rarely returned them. She had worked at St. Gabriel Medical Center for nearly 8 years, arriving before sunrise most mornings and leaving long after many doctors had returned home. She never complained. She simply believed every person deserved to walk into a clean and welcoming place, even if nobody ever remembered who made it possible. As Vanessa stepped around a crowded conversation near the center of the ballroom, one guest suddenly backed away without looking. His shoulder brushed against the tray balanced on her cart. Several glasses tipped over, sending water spilling across the marble floor with a sharp clatter that echoed through the elegant hall. Conversation stopped almost instantly. Dozens of heads turned toward the sound. A woman wearing an expensive evening gown shook her head with obvious annoyance. Another guest laughed loudly before whispering something to his companion that caused several nearby people to smile. Within seconds, the quiet embarrassment became public entertainment. Vanessa immediately reached for clean towels. "I am so sorry," she said calmly, kneeling to wipe the water before anyone slipped. The man who had accidentally caused the spill said nothing. Instead, he stepped aside and allowed others to stare as though the mistake belonged entirely to her. Someone near the back of the crowd chuckled. Another voice joked that housekeeping should stay out of the ballroom during important events. The laughter spread just enough for Vanessa to hear every word. She did not defend herself. She did not argue. She simply continued drying the floor with steady hands, refusing to let humiliation interrupt her work. Then another voice cut gently through the uncomfortable laughter. "May I help you?" The room grew quieter as Dr. Daniel Foster stepped forward. At 37 years old, he had already become one of the hospital's most respected cardiothoracic surgeons, admired not only for extraordinary skill, but also for treating every employee with equal respect. Without hesitation, he accepted several towels from another staff member and knelt beside Vanessa, helping her finish cleaning the spill. The unexpected gesture drew confused looks from every direction. A renowned surgeon was kneeling on the ballroom floor beside a housekeeper while donors and executives watched in stunned silence. When the last drop of water had been wiped away, Daniel stood and offered Vanessa a genuine smile. "Thank you for taking such good care of this place every day," he said warmly. Vanessa looked surprised. "I was only doing my job." Daniel shook his head. "You do much more than that." For a brief moment, neither of them noticed the whispers beginning again throughout the ballroom. Some guests exchanged amused glances. Others assumed the doctor was performing for attention. Then Daniel spoke clearly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Ms. Brooks, would you allow me to take you to dinner after your shift one evening?" A wave of astonished murmurs swept across the room. Several guests laughed openly. One man nearly dropped his drink. A woman covered her mouth while trying unsuccessfully to hide her smile. The invitation sounded so unexpected that many assumed it had to be a joke. Vanessa herself blinked in surprise before answering with quiet grace. "Dr. Foster, that is very kind of you, but I still have several hours of work tonight." Daniel smiled just as sincerely as before. "Then I will gladly wait until you have finished." The laughter grew louder. Across the ballroom, standing near the entrance beneath the glow of the crystal chandeliers, another man had witnessed every second without saying a single word. Dressed in an impeccably tailored black suit, Ethan Walker, A white Korean mafia boss whose influence reached far beyond the city, remained completely still as his sharp eyes moved from the laughing crowd to the woman quietly holding her cleaning towels. He said nothing. He simply watched, and somehow the calm expression on his face carried far more weight than the noise filling the room. Sometimes the cruelest judgments are spoken by people who know the least about the person standing in front of them. The laughter that swept across the ballroom did not disappear after Dr. Daniel Foster invited Vanessa Brooks to dinner. Instead, it spread through the elegant hall in quiet whispers disguised as polite conversation. Several donors exchanged amused smiles, while a few younger physicians glanced at one another with obvious disbelief. One woman leaned toward her husband and quietly suggested that perhaps the famous surgeon had finally decided to entertain himself after another exhausting week at the hospital. Another guest wondered aloud whether someone had secretly arranged the moment as part of the evening's fundraising program. Vanessa heard enough to understand that very few people believed the invitation had been sincere. Yet her expression remained calm. She gently folded the cleaning towels over her housekeeping cart before looking at Daniel with the same respectful composure she offered every patient, visitor, and employee she encountered each day. "Dr. Foster," she said softly, "I truly appreciate your kindness, but my responsibilities come first. There are still several rooms that need attention before this event ends." Daniel nodded without the slightest disappointment. "Then your responsibilities should come first," he replied. "Dinner can wait. Respect should never be rushed." His answer only fueled more speculation. A guest standing near the dessert table laughed quietly and remarked that no surgeon with Daniel's reputation would seriously invite a hospital housekeeper to dinner. Another insisted there had to be a hidden reason. Perhaps it was charity. Perhaps it was pity. Perhaps it was simply an awkward attempt to appear humble before wealthy donors. None of those assumptions reached Daniel's face. He remained completely at ease, as though the opinions surrounding him carried no weight at all. Vanessa offered a grateful smile before carefully guiding her cart toward the service hallway. She neither accepted nor rejected the invitation completely. She simply returned to her work, leaving behind a crowd that seemed far more interested in gossip than generosity. Near the entrance, Ethan Walker continued observing every movement. The white Korean mafia boss had attended the gala only because one of the hospital's largest donors had personally requested his presence. Public charity events rarely interested him. He preferred solving problems quietly, without photographs or speeches. Yet something about the exchange between the surgeon and the housekeeper held his attention in a way the expensive decorations and polished speeches never could. Benjamin Ross, his trusted chief of staff, stepped beside him and lowered his voice. "Should I find out what that was about?" Ethan kept his eyes on the hallway where Vanessa had disappeared. "Not yet." Benjamin looked toward Daniel, who had calmly returned to greeting guests as though nothing unusual had happened. "Most people think he was making a joke." Ethan answered without hesitation. He was not joking. Benjamin studied the surgeon for another moment. "You sound certain." Ethan finally shifted his gaze toward the growing crowd. People who seek attention always look toward the audience before they speak. He never looked anywhere except at her. Benjamin quietly absorbed the observation. During years of working beside Ethan, he had learned that the mafia boss noticed details most people ignored. Across the ballroom, the hospital's chief executive approached Daniel with a courteous smile. Several influential donors surrounded them, curious enough to ask whether the surprising invitation had been part of some planned presentation. Daniel answered with complete sincerity. "No, I asked because I wanted to ask." The simplicity of his response confused them even more. One executive laughed awkwardly before changing the subject, clearly assuming the conversation had become too uncomfortable to continue. Meanwhile, Vanessa worked quietly through the service corridors, replacing trash liners, wiping counters, and helping another employee prepare fresh coffee for the late evening guests. She carried herself with the same quiet professionalism she had shown every day for nearly 8 years. Not once did she mention the invitation. Not once did she complain about the laughter. A younger housekeeping employee finally whispered, "Are you all right?" Vanessa smiled gently while arranging clean cups onto a serving tray. "People are free to think whatever they wish," she answered. "We are only responsible for how we treat them in return." Those simple words lingered in the quiet hallway long after she returned to work. Back inside the ballroom, Ethan looked once more toward the service doors before calmly setting his untouched glass of sparkling water onto a nearby table. Without another word, he turned to Benjamin. "Tomorrow morning," he said evenly, "I want to know everything about Dr. Daniel Foster and Vanessa Brooks. Not the rumors. The truth." Benjamin gave a single respectful nod, already understanding that what had begun as an awkward moment during a charity gala had quietly become something far more important. The greatest acts of kindness are almost never announced. They are discovered only after someone cares enough to look beyond appearances. The following morning, while most of the city hurried through another busy weekday, Benjamin Ross walked into Ethan Walker's private office carrying a slim black folder instead of the thick investigative reports he usually prepared. He placed it gently on the polished walnut desk before taking a seat across from the white Korean Mafia boss. Ethan noticed the difference immediately. "That does not look like much," he said. Benjamin nodded. "It is not much because there is almost nothing negative to report." Ethan leaned back quietly. "Start with Vanessa Brooks." Benjamin opened the folder. 31 years old. She has worked at St. Gabriel Medical Center for 7 years and 9 months. No disciplinary actions. No complaints from patients. No financial problems. No criminal record. No public recognition either. Ethan remained silent, encouraging him to continue. Benjamin turned another page. "She has never applied for promotions, even when supervisors encouraged her. She always volunteers for overnight holiday shifts because employees with young children usually ask for those days off." Ethan slowly folded his hands together. "That explains why she was still working during the gala." Benjamin nodded again. "There is something else." He removed several photocopies from the folder. These came from anonymous employee appreciation letters submitted over the past 6 years. Ethan accepted the papers. None of them carried Vanessa's name in the title, yet nearly every letter described the same person. One nurse wrote about arriving for a difficult night shift after losing her father only to find a handwritten note beside the coffee machine that simply read, "You are stronger than today feels." Another employee described discovering grocery store gift cards tucked inside a locker after unexpected medical bills had overwhelmed her family. A maintenance worker recalled finding warm breakfast sandwiches waiting for the overnight crew every Christmas morning, though nobody ever admitted purchasing them. Ethan looked up. "These were all Vanessa?" Benjamin answered quietly. "Every detail points back to her, but she never signed anything." Ethan continued reading. One letter described an elderly patient who had no visitors during 3 weeks of recovery. According to the nurse who wrote the note, Vanessa quietly stopped by every evening after finishing her cleaning rounds. She read newspaper articles aloud because the patient had poor eyesight and no family nearby. Another account came from a young respiratory therapist who had accidentally forgotten her lunch during a double shift. Vanessa had divided her own meal in half without saying a word. She simply smiled and insisted she had already eaten. Ethan placed the papers back onto the desk with unusual care. "Did anyone ever recommend her for an award?" Benjamin gave a faint smile. "Several people tried." He slid another document across the desk. It was a nomination form for the hospital's annual Community Heart Award. Vanessa's name appeared on it 5 separate times over the years. Every nomination praised her quiet generosity, her professionalism, and her compassion toward patients and co-workers alike. Yet each form carried the same handwritten note across the top. "Declined by nominee." Ethan raised one eyebrow. "She refused." "Every single time," Benjamin confirmed. "Hospital administration even asked her directly last year. She thanked them and said there were nurses and doctors saving lives every day who deserved recognition far more than she did." The office became unusually quiet. Ethan stared through the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking downtown Chicago, reflecting on the previous evening. While hundreds of influential guests had celebrated generosity beneath crystal chandeliers, the woman they laughed at had quietly spent years practicing it without applause. Benjamin turned to the final section of the report. Dr. Daniel Foster was easier to investigate. Ethan looked back. "What did you find?" Benjamin smiled slightly. "He has one of the strongest professional reputations in the state. Outstanding surgeon. Volunteers at free medical clinics twice every month. But there is one detail that stands out." Ethan waited. "For the past 11 years, Dr. Foster has personally requested the overnight housekeeping schedule every January. Ethan frowned with curiosity. Why? Benjamin closed the folder. Nobody knows. Human Resources assumed he needed it for staffing coordination after emergency surgeries, but the request had nothing to do with surgery schedules. Ethan remained thoughtful. Two separate lives. Two quiet patterns. One unexplained connection stretching back more than a decade. It no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like the beginning of a story almost everyone else had been too distracted to notice. Ethan slowly stood from his chair and picked up the employee appreciation letters once more. Most people walked into that ballroom believing they already knew who Vanessa Brooks was, he said softly. Now I want to know who she has always been. Benjamin nodded respectfully, sensing that the answer waiting somewhere inside St. Gabriel Medical Center would not simply explain a dinner invitation. It would reveal a kindness so consistent that it had quietly shaped countless lives while asking for nothing in return. The truth rarely arrives with applause. More often, it waits quietly for someone willing to listen. 2 days after the charity gala, Ethan Walker stepped into St. Gabriel Medical Center without the usual attention that followed his name. He wore a simple charcoal suit with no security team surrounding him, accompanied only by Benjamin Ross. The hospital administration assumed he had returned to discuss another charitable donation, and within minutes they escorted him to a private conference room where Dr. Daniel Foster was already waiting. Daniel greeted both men with calm professionalism, offering a firm handshake before taking his seat. Ethan wasted no time with formalities. Dr. Foster, he said evenly, I am not here to discuss the gala. I am here because I believe your invitation to Vanessa Brooks was genuine. Daniel did not appear surprised. Instead, he smiled faintly, almost with relief. It was. Benjamin leaned forward. Then perhaps you can explain something. Half the city believes you were making a joke. Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment before answering. That says more about the city than it does about me. Silence settled across the room. Ethan studied the surgeon's face carefully. There was no embarrassment, no hesitation, and certainly no regret. Only quiet certainty. Why Vanessa? Ethan finally asked. Daniel looked toward the window overlooking the hospital courtyard where patients and families slowly crossed the walking paths beneath blooming maple trees. 11 years ago, he began, I was a second-year medical student. My mother was admitted here after suffering a severe heart condition. She remained in the intensive care unit for nearly 3 weeks. His voice remained steady, but something softened behind his eyes. My father had already passed away, and I was balancing medical school, part-time jobs, and hospital visits. I believed I was doing everything I could for her. Then one evening I arrived late after an important examination and found my mother smiling in a way I had not seen for days. Ethan listened without interrupting. She asked if I had met the kind woman who visited every evening after finishing her work. I assumed she meant a nurse. She shook her head and said it was one of the housekeepers. Daniel smiled gently at the memory. That woman was Vanessa Brooks. Benjamin exchanged a quick glance with Ethan, but remained silent. Daniel continued. My mother told me Vanessa would sit with patients who had no visitors. Sometimes she read newspapers aloud. Sometimes she simply listened. Other nights, she helped people write letters because arthritis made holding a pen difficult. She brought extra blankets before anyone asked. She remembered birthdays that medical charts never mentioned. She made lonely people feel seen. Ethan rested both hands on the table. Did you ever thank her? Daniel's expression became thoughtful. I tried. He looked down briefly before continuing. The day my mother was discharged, I searched every floor for Vanessa. Someone told me she had stayed late helping another patient whose family could not make it before visiting hours ended. I left a thank you note with the front desk, but I never knew whether she received it. He paused, allowing the memory to settle naturally. A month later, my mother passed away peacefully at home. The room remained completely still. Daniel drew a slow breath before speaking again. Before she died, she told me something I have never forgotten. She said, Daniel, people will remember your surgeries because they save lives, but they will remember kindness, because it gives them reasons to keep living. Ethan quietly absorbed every word. After becoming a physician, I transferred to this hospital. I recognized Vanessa on my very first day. She recognized me too, but she only smiled and asked whether I was taking good care of my patients. She never mentioned what she had done for my mother. She acted as though it had never mattered. Benjamin asked softly, "Why did you wait until the gala to invite her to dinner?" Daniel looked directly at him. "Because I asked her every January if she would allow me to thank her over dinner. Every January she politely declined, saying the hospital needed her more than a restaurant did. This year I decided to ask publicly because I hoped she would finally understand that gratitude is not something to hide." Ethan remained silent for several long seconds. Everything Benjamin had uncovered now fit together with remarkable clarity. The annual housekeeping schedules, the years of unanswered invitations, the quiet consistency of both lives. There had never been pity. There had never been performance. There had only been one man determined to repay a debt of kindness and one woman who had never believed she deserved repayment at all. As Ethan rose from his chair, his expression remained calm, but something had changed behind his eyes. He now understood that the laughter filling the ballroom had not been directed at an ordinary housekeeper. It had been aimed at one of the most quietly remarkable people in the entire hospital, and very few of those laughing had ever truly seen her. Respect does not disappear because a crowd refuses to recognize it. It simply waits for the moment when truth becomes impossible to ignore. News of the unusual dinner invitation continued circulating through St. Gabriel Medical Center for the rest of the week. Although no official announcement had ever been made, conversations drifted through nurses' stations, staff lounges, and administrative offices with remarkable speed. Some employees defended Dr. Daniel Foster, insisting that he had always treated everyone with equal kindness. Others quietly questioned his motives, unable to imagine why one of the hospital's most accomplished surgeons would repeatedly invite a housekeeper to dinner. Outside the hospital, several influential donors who had attended the gala shared their own versions of the story during business lunches and charity meetings. Each retelling became slightly more exaggerated than the last. By Friday afternoon, the invitation had transformed into little more than an amusing piece of gossip for people who had never bothered to learn Vanessa Brooks's name before that evening. Vanessa remained completely unaware of how widely the story had spread. She continued arriving before sunrise, greeting security officers with the same warm smile, checking supply closets, and quietly beginning another day of work. She polished waiting room windows, organized visitor areas, and paused long enough to help an elderly man locate the correct elevator after he became confused while searching for his wife's recovery room. Every action reflected the same quiet patience that had shaped nearly 8 years inside the hospital. She neither mentioned the gala nor spoke about Dr. Foster's invitation. To her, the patience still mattered more than the whispers surrounding her. Late that afternoon, the hospital hosted a small reception for several major donors considering a new pediatric expansion project. Administrators hoped the informal gathering would strengthen relationships before the upcoming fundraising campaign officially began. Vanessa had been assigned to prepare refreshments and maintain the conference suite after each presentation ended. As she entered with a fresh tray of coffee and bottled water, several guests from the charity gala immediately recognized her. One businessman smiled in a way that suggested he expected entertainment more than conversation. "Well," he said loudly enough for others to hear, "there is the most popular woman in the hospital." A few people laughed politely. Another guest added, "Have you scheduled that famous dinner yet?" Vanessa calmly placed the refreshments onto the serving table before answering with complete courtesy, "I hope everyone enjoys the meeting this afternoon." She offered nothing more. Her refusal to encourage the conversation only seemed to invite additional remarks. One woman remarked that perhaps becoming friends with surgeons was the fastest path to promotion. Another suggested that newspapers might enjoy such an unusual story. Vanessa simply continued arranging cups and napkins with steady hands, never allowing irritation to appear on her face. At that very moment, Daniel entered the conference suite carrying several patient files. He immediately sensed the uncomfortable atmosphere. Looking around the room, he noticed the amused expressions, the sideways glances, and finally Vanessa quietly finishing her work without responding to any of the comments directed toward her. Daniel placed the files onto the conference table and spoke with calm confidence. "Ms. Brooks has work to do. If anyone has questions about my invitation, you may ask me instead." The room grew noticeably quieter, but one donor crossed his arms with a skeptical smile. "Doctor, surely you understand why people find this unusual." Daniel met his gaze without anger. I understand that many people find gratitude unusual because they rarely practice it. No one answered immediately. Before another voice could break the silence, the conference room doors opened once again. Ethan Walker entered alongside Benjamin Ross, arriving for a scheduled meeting with hospital leadership regarding the pediatric expansion project. Several administrators quickly stood to greet him, but Ethan's attention shifted almost instantly toward the unusual tension filling the room. His eyes moved from Daniel to Vanessa and finally toward the guests whose expressions revealed that something unpleasant had just taken place. Benjamin quietly recognized several faces from the charity gala and understood exactly what was happening. Ethan did not ask for an explanation. He simply observed each person with the same composed expression that had unsettled powerful men for years. Vanessa finished arranging the last coffee cup, offered a polite nod to everyone present, and prepared to leave the room. Daniel watched her with quiet respect. The donors watched with lingering curiosity. Ethan watched with growing certainty. He now understood that the real test of character had never belonged to the woman everyone underestimated. It belonged to the people who continued measuring another human being by a uniform instead of by the life she had quietly spent lifting others. The room waited, almost unconsciously, for someone to speak next, unaware that only a few carefully chosen words were about to change every conversation that had begun since the night of the gala. Silence carries the greatest weight when it follows words that cannot be argued with. The conference suite seemed to grow smaller as every conversation faded into an uneasy hush. Hospital administrators remained standing beside the polished oak table, unsure whether to continue welcoming Ethan Walker or pretend they had not witnessed the uncomfortable exchange that had unfolded only moments earlier. Vanessa Brooks quietly lifted the empty serving tray into her hands, hoping to leave without drawing any more attention to herself. She had spent years avoiding the spotlight because she believed kindness should never become a performance. Yet before she reached the doorway, Ethan spoke in a calm voice that carried naturally through the room. "Ms. Brooks." Vanessa stopped and turned respectfully. "Yes, sir." Ethan looked at her for a brief moment before shifting his attention toward the donors, executives, and guests whose expressions still carried traces of amusement. His eyes moved slowly across the room, meeting one face after another until nobody seemed comfortable holding his gaze. Then he spoke only 4 words. She earned respect first. Nothing more. No raised voice. No lecture. No accusation. Just 4 simple words delivered with complete certainty. The room became so still that even the quiet hum of the air conditioning seemed unusually loud. Several people lowered their eyes almost instinctively. Others glanced toward Vanessa for the first time not as an anonymous housekeeper, but as someone whose story they suddenly realized they had never bothered to learn. The businessman who had joked about her becoming famous shifted awkwardly in his chair before looking down at the conference agenda in front of him. The woman who had suggested newspapers might enjoy the story quietly folded her hands together, finding nothing left to say. Daniel Foster watched the silence settle across the room with quiet gratitude. He understood that Ethan had not defended Vanessa because of influence or reputation. He had defended the principle that dignity belongs to a person long before titles, uniforms, or wealth ever enter the picture. Ethan stepped forward at an unhurried pace until he stood beside Vanessa. "Dr. Foster has already explained why he invited you to dinner," he said softly enough for everyone to hear. Vanessa looked surprised. He did not owe anyone an explanation. Ethan nodded once. "No, he did not." He then turned back toward the gathering. "But perhaps all of you owed her one." No one answered. There was no anger in Ethan's voice, only disappointment wrapped inside quiet honesty. Benjamin Ross remained near the entrance, observing how dramatically the atmosphere had changed. Only minutes earlier the room had been filled with comfortable assumptions. Now every person present seemed to be reconsidering words that could never be taken back. One senior administrator finally cleared his throat. "Ms. Brooks," he began carefully, "I believe many of us have overlooked the contributions you have made here." Vanessa offered a gentle smile that carried neither pride nor resentment. "Everyone contributes in different ways," she replied. "The patients are what matter." Her answer made the silence even deeper. She had been given an opportunity to embarrass those who had mocked her, yet she refused to use it. Instead, She redirected every bit of attention back toward the people the hospital existed to serve. Daniel smiled quietly because the response sounded exactly like the woman he had remembered for more than a decade. Ethan noticed it as well. Respect, he realized, had become such a natural part of Vanessa's character that she no longer expected it from others before offering it herself. The hospital president slowly walked toward Vanessa with genuine sincerity, replacing the practiced confidence he usually displayed at fundraising events. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I do not believe we have thanked you nearly enough for what you have given this hospital." Vanessa answered with the same humility she had carried throughout every shift. "You gave me the opportunity to work here. That has always been enough." Several employees standing near the back of the room exchanged emotional glances. They had witnessed countless quiet acts of kindness from Vanessa over the years, but hearing her speak without bitterness reminded them why patients, nurses, maintenance workers, and security officers trusted her so deeply. Ethan looked once more around the conference suite. Nobody was smiling at Vanessa anymore. Nobody was whispering. Nobody seemed interested in gossip. They were confronting something much more uncomfortable than public embarrassment. They were confronting the possibility that they had spent years overlooking one of the finest examples of character inside their own hospital simply because she wore a housekeeping uniform. As Vanessa finally stepped through the doorway with her serving tray, every eye followed her in respectful silence. And for the first time since the night of the gala, not a single person saw an invisible employee leaving the room. They saw a woman whose quiet life had just reminded them what genuine dignity looked like. Real character reveals itself, not when people finally applaud, but when they discover they never needed the applause in the first place. The quiet that followed Vanessa Brooks out of the conference suite lingered long after the door closed behind her. No one seemed eager to restart the meeting. The fundraising presentations, architectural drawings, and financial projections resting neatly across the conference table suddenly felt insignificant compared to the lesson that had unfolded only moments earlier. Ethan Walker remained standing beside the window, watching hospital staff move through the courtyard below with purposeful determination. Nurses hurried toward the emergency entrance. Volunteers escorted visitors through unfamiliar hallways. Maintenance workers checked equipment that most people never noticed. Every role mattered, yet only some received recognition. Ethan finally turned back toward the room. "Dr. Foster," he said calmly, "I believe everyone here deserves to hear the entire story." Daniel nodded slowly before looking around the table. "I have never shared it publicly because Vanessa would never have wanted attention. But perhaps silence has protected the wrong people." Every conversation stopped completely. Daniel rested both hands lightly against the back of a chair before continuing. "When my mother was recovering here 11 years ago, there were nights she felt forgotten. The medication helped her body, but loneliness weighed heavily on her spirit. I believed I was giving her everything she needed, yet I could only visit between classes and work. Vanessa noticed that before I did." Several administrators exchanged thoughtful glances. Daniel continued with quiet sincerity. "She never introduced herself as someone extraordinary. She simply walked into my mother's room each evening after finishing her housekeeping duties. She straightened flowers that had begun to wilt. She adjusted blankets before anyone requested them. She listened to stories that had already been told dozens of times, because she understood that elderly people often repeat memories they are afraid the world will forget." A nurse seated near the far end of the table suddenly smiled through moist eyes. "I remember that," she whispered almost to herself. Daniel looked toward her and nodded. "You were working nights back then." The nurse smiled gently. She always carried extra tea bags in her pocket because some patients slept better after warm tea. She paid for them herself. Another employee slowly raised his hand. "I remember seeing her buy birthday balloons for children whose parents could not afford decorations." A respiratory therapist quietly added, "She stayed with a veteran every Thanksgiving because his family lived across the country. He always told us that she made the hospital feel more like home." One memory led naturally to another. A security officer recalled Vanessa comforting a frightened little boy until his mother returned from surgery. A volunteer described watching her spend her lunch break helping an elderly visitor complete insurance paperwork because the forms were too confusing. A pharmacist remembered arriving before dawn one winter morning to find Vanessa clearing snow from the employee entrance so nurses could safely reach the building. None of those stories had ever appeared in newsletters or award ceremonies. They simply lived inside the grateful memories of ordinary people. Ethan quietly listened as the room transformed from uncomfortable silence into honest reflection. The businessman who had mocked Vanessa earlier lowered his head. "I spoke about her without knowing any of this," he admitted softly. "I never even asked her name." No one criticized him because several others realized they had done exactly the same thing. Daniel looked around the room with gentle understanding. "That is why I kept inviting her to dinner every January. I was never trying to impress her. I was trying to thank someone who had changed my mother's final weeks and, in many ways, changed the kind of physician I wanted to become." Ethan folded his hands thoughtfully. "And every year she refused because she believed she had only done her job." Daniel smiled. "Exactly." The hospital president slowly rose from his chair. "Perhaps the problem is not that Vanessa never accepted recognition. Perhaps the problem is that we accepted her refusal too easily." His words settled over the room with quiet force. They all realized how convenient it had been to admire humility without insisting that genuine goodness deserved acknowledgement. Outside the conference suite, completely unaware of the conversation taking place, Vanessa continued wiping fingerprints from a waiting room window while patiently showing an anxious grandfather where he could find the pediatric wing. She smiled with the same warmth she had shown every stranger for years, expecting nothing in return. Watching through the glass corridor, Ethan understood something that money, influence, and power had never fully taught him. The strongest people were often those who carried kindness so naturally that they no longer noticed its extraordinary weight, while everyone else mistook quiet service for ordinary work until the truth finally gave them the courage to see what had been standing before them all along. True gratitude does not seek a stage. It waits patiently until the person who deserves it is finally willing to receive it. The following Tuesday evening, as the final rays of sunlight settled over the city, the steady rhythm of St. Gabriel Medical Center began to slow. Visitors made their way toward the parking garage. Nurses exchanged patient reports at the end of their shifts, and housekeeping staff quietly completed the last details that allowed the hospital to welcome another day. Vanessa Brooks carefully placed the final supply cart back into the storage room before removing her work gloves and smoothing the sleeves of her blue uniform. She expected another ordinary walk to the employee exit, but as she stepped into the hallway, she found Dr. Daniel Foster waiting beside the elevator with the same patient smile he had worn during the charity gala. He did not appear nervous or hurried. He simply greeted her as though no time had passed. "Good evening, Ms. Brooks." Vanessa smiled warmly. "Good evening, Doctor." Daniel hesitated for only a moment before speaking. "You once told me that work should always come first. Your shift is over now. Would you allow me to ask one more time?" Vanessa looked at him quietly. She could see there was no pressure behind his words, only sincere appreciation. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The silence felt comfortable rather than awkward. Finally, she gave a gentle smile. "If you are still inviting me because you wish to say thank you, then I believe I should finally stop making you wait." Daniel laughed softly, relieved in a way that surprised even himself. "That is exactly why I am asking." They left the hospital together through the employee entrance rather than the grand front lobby. There were no photographers waiting outside, no curious audience, and no expensive celebration. Daniel had chosen a small family-owned restaurant only a few blocks away, a quiet place known for homemade soups, fresh bread, and simple American comfort food. The owner greeted several nurses by name as they entered, and neither Daniel nor Vanessa attracted much attention. They sat by a window overlooking a peaceful neighborhood street where children rode bicycles beneath the fading evening sky. For the first several minutes, they spoke about ordinary things. Vanessa asked about Daniel's patients. Daniel asked whether the overnight housekeeping team still gathered for coffee before sunrise every Friday. The conversation felt surprisingly natural, as though two old friends were catching up after many years apart. Eventually, Daniel reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed a slightly worn envelope. "My mother wrote this a few weeks before she passed away," he said quietly. "I carried it with me for years because I hoped I would someday have the opportunity to give it to the person it was meant for." Vanessa looked genuinely surprised as she accepted the envelope with both hands. Inside rested a neatly folded letter written in careful handwriting. She read silently, while Daniel respectfully looked away. The letter thanked her for treating an elderly woman as though she still mattered when illness had made her feel invisible. It spoke of warm conversations, shared prayers, stories about childhood, and the comfort of knowing that kindness could still be found in unexpected places. Near the end, one sentence caused Vanessa's eyes to glisten with quiet emotion. "You reminded me that dignity is not something sickness can take away when another human being chooses to protect it." Vanessa slowly folded the letter again before pressing it gently against her heart. "I never knew she felt this way," she whispered. Daniel smiled. "She wanted you to know. I simply needed many years to find the right moment." Neither of them noticed a black sedan quietly passing the restaurant before continuing down the street. Inside, Ethan Walker sat beside Benjamin Ross after concluding another business meeting nearby. Ethan recognized the restaurant through the window and briefly saw Daniel and Vanessa sitting across from one another with nothing more than soup, bread, warm conversation, and a single handwritten letter resting between them. He watched only for a moment before asking the driver to continue. Benjamin glanced back through the rear window. "You are not going inside?" Ethan answered with quiet certainty. "No. Gratitude does not need witnesses." The sedan disappeared into the evening traffic while, inside the small restaurant, Vanessa carefully thanked Daniel for preserving his mother's words all those years. She explained that she had never considered her visits extraordinary because lonely people deserve company just as much as medicine. Daniel listened with quiet admiration, realizing that the woman everyone had underestimated still believed she had done nothing remarkable. Yet as the evening settled peacefully around them, both understood that this dinner had never been about romance, status, or appearances. It had always been about honoring a debt that could never truly be repaid, only remembered with gratitude and carried forward through the kindness they chose to show others. The world does not always change through dramatic victories. Sometimes it changes because ordinary people decide they will never overlook quiet goodness again. Nearly 1 year passed after that unforgettable week at St. Gabriel Medical Center, and although the hospital looked much the same from the outside, something inside its walls had quietly transformed. Employees greeted one another more intentionally. New staff orientation included a simple reminder that every role within the hospital carried equal dignity, because healing depended on far more than medicine alone. Doctors thanked environmental services workers by name. Administrators spent time listening to departments that had once been overlooked. The changes were small enough to escape newspaper headlines, yet meaningful enough to reshape the culture of the hospital one conversation at a time. Vanessa Brooks noticed the difference, although she never claimed responsibility for it. She continued arriving before sunrise, smiling at patients, comforting anxious families, and helping co-workers whenever she could. The only visible change in her daily routine came several months later when the hospital president invited her into his office. Instead of presenting another award she would politely decline, he offered her a newly created position coordinating the hospital's volunteer kindness program, allowing her to mentor volunteers and organize support for patients who lacked family nearby. Vanessa accepted only after asking one question: "Will I still have time to visit the patients?" The president smiled warmly. "That is exactly why we hope you will say yes." She did. Soon volunteers learned how a warm conversation could ease fear before surgery, how remembering birthdays could brighten long recoveries, and how listening without rushing often became its own form of healing. Daniel Foster continued performing life-saving surgeries with the same skill that had earned him national respect, yet many people noticed that he never rushed past housekeeping staff, cafeteria workers, receptionists, or security officers without stopping to greet them. Whenever young medical residents asked what quality mattered most in becoming an excellent physician, Daniel surprised them with the same answer every time. "Technical excellence saves lives," he would say. "Respect reminds people why those lives matter." He never mentioned that lesson had been taught to him by a woman carrying a housekeeping cart through quiet hospital corridors. Ethan Walker never returned to the hospital seeking recognition for the 4 words that had silenced an entire room. Instead, he established an anonymous charitable fund supporting hospital employees facing unexpected family emergencies. Applications required no public announcements and no photographs. Assistance simply appeared whenever it was needed most. Only Benjamin Ross knew who provided the funding, and even he understood that Ethan wanted no credit. One afternoon, Benjamin asked why he insisted on remaining anonymous. Ethan looked toward the city skyline before answering. Because I finally met someone who spent years changing lives without asking anyone to remember her name. Months later, during another annual charity gala, the ballroom once again filled with elegant guests beneath crystal chandeliers. This time, however, the evening opened differently. Before the keynote speaker approached the stage, the hospital president invited Vanessa Brooks forward. She hesitated, clearly uncomfortable with standing in front of hundreds of people, but the applause that welcomed her carried none of the laughter heard the previous year. It carried gratitude. Looking across the audience, Vanessa recognized nurses, maintenance workers, surgeons, volunteers, patients, and families whose lives had crossed hers in quiet moments over many years. Daniel smiled proudly from one side of the ballroom. Ethan stood quietly near the back beside Benjamin, choosing once again to remain unnoticed. Vanessa accepted a simple crystal plaque before stepping to the microphone. She did not deliver a long speech. She simply looked around the room and said, "Every person who walks through these doors is carrying something we cannot see. If we choose kindness before judgment, we will rarely regret it." The audience rose together in a standing ovation that lasted far longer than anyone expected. Some people applauded because they admired her. Others applauded because they remembered how quickly they had once underestimated her. Ethan quietly turned toward the exit before the applause ended. Benjamin smiled and asked whether they should stay for the photographs. Ethan gently shook his head. "No," he replied. "She earned this long before anyone started clapping." They walked out into the cool evening air while, inside the ballroom, Vanessa remained surrounded by grateful colleagues whose respect no longer depended upon a uniform or a title. And on that quiet night, everyone who had witnessed her journey finally understood that the strongest measure of a person's worth is not found in the position they hold, but in the dignity they protect in others every single day.